Rebecca Lang disappeared on a cloudless morning in August 2003, 37 years old and 4 months pregnant, flying a single-engine Cessna 182 from Lancaster to Phoenix with a cargo of surveying equipment destined for a construction company expanding operations into Arizona. The flight plan indicated a direct route over the Mojave Desert, a journey she'd made 11 times before without incident, a path she knew as well as the streets of her own neighborhood. Her husband, David, kissed her goodbye at the hangar door of General William J. Fox Airfield just after sunrise, watched the propeller catch the morning sun in a flash of silver light, and never saw her again. She'd been a pilot for 14 years, accumulating over 1,200 flight hours, earning her instrument rating and commercial license through dedication and countless hours of study. Friends at the airfield described her as cautious, methodical, the kind of pilot who checked the weather 3 times and walked around her aircraft twice before every flight. She was building a life, a good life, with David, preparing a nursery, picking out names, dreaming about a future that would end somewhere over the Mojave that August morning. The Mojave stretched beneath her wings that morning, vast and unforgiving, a landscape of extremes where temperatures already climbed toward 105 degrees even before noon. It was a desert of Joshua trees, standing like twisted sentinels, of creosote bushes spreading across bajadas and alluvial fans, of mountains that rose abruptly from flat valleys and cast shadows that could hide entire canyons. Rebecca radioed Lancaster Tower at 9:47 a.m., confirming her departure, her voice calm and professional as always, the same voice David had fallen in love with, steady, confident, unafraid. At 10:22 a.m., she checked in with Barstow Approach Control, reporting clear skies and smooth air, visibility unlimited, everything proceeding exactly as planned. Her transmission was routine, unremarkable, the kind of communication that happens thousands of times every day in airspace across America. Then silence, complete, absolute, devastating silence that would stretch for 21 years. If you're following Rebecca's story, please subscribe to the channel and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. Your support helps us bring these untold stories to light. David received the call at 2:15 p.m. from the FAA regional office in Los Angeles. Rebecca hadn't arrived in Phoenix according to her flight plan. She hadn't responded to radio calls from controllers who'd tried to reach her on multiple frequencies. Her emergency locator transmitter, a device specifically designed to activate automatically upon impact and transmit a distress signal for at least 24 hours on 121, 5 MHz and 406 MHz frequencies, had never sent a signal that any ground station or satellite could detect. Search and rescue teams from the Air Force Rescue Coordination Center launched immediately, scouring a corridor 50 miles wide along her planned flight path, deploying Civil Air Patrol aircraft equipped with direction-finding equipment designed to locate ELT signals. They found nothing, no wreckage, no beacon signal, no scorched earth, no disturbed vegetation, no trace whatsoever of the white and blue Cessna that had simply vanished into the desert's pale vastness as if it had never existed. For 3 weeks, volunteers joined the search in numbers that surprised even veteran coordinators. David flew with them daily, his eyes scanning the endless landscape of creosote bush and Joshua trees, the ravines and washes that could swallow an aircraft whole and hide it from even the most determined searchers. The Civil Air Patrol logged 847 flight hours, their pilots crisscrossing the desert in grid patterns, flying low enough to read license plates on abandoned cars, high enough to cover vast swathes of territory. Ground teams hiked through temperatures that reached 120 degrees in the lower elevations, where the air shimmered and distorted vision, where heat exhaustion became a constant threat and water consumption reached a gallon per hour per person. They searched washes and canyons, examined every piece of metal debris they encountered, investigated reports from hikers and off-road enthusiasts who thought they'd seen something unusual. Rebecca's mother, Patricia, set up a command center in a Barstow motel room, coordinating volunteers, fielding tips from psychics and well-meaning strangers who called at all hours, refusing to believe her daughter was gone, even as the days passed, without a single piece of evidence. The official search ended on September 9, 2003, exactly 1 month after Rebecca disappeared. The investigation remained open, classified as an active missing aircraft case in FAA and NTSB databases, but active search operations ceased due to diminishing probability of finding survivors and the enormous cost of continued aerial reconnaissance. David returned to their home in Lancaster, to the nursery they'd been painting yellow, to the crib they'd assembled together on a Sunday afternoon while laughing about the confusing instructions. He returned to a life that had been shattered in a single morning, to questions that had no answers, to a grief that had no body to mourn, no grave to visit, no closure to offer even the smallest measure of peace. Patricia never stopped, never accepted the end of official operations as the end of the search itself. She hired private investigators who specialized in missing persons cases, posted rewards that eventually totaled $75,000, drove the back roads of the Mojave every weekend for years, convinced that somewhere in that desert her daughter was waiting to be found, that persistence would eventually yield what technology and manpower had failed to discover. The years passed with the weight of unanswered questions pressing down on everyone who'd known Rebecca. David eventually remarried 6 years later, though he never stopped thinking about Rebecca, about the child they'd been expecting, a girl, according to the ultrasound Rebecca had shown him the week before she disappeared, about the cruel randomness of disappearance that left wounds that never fully healed. Patricia developed a network of desert hikers and off-road enthusiasts who promised to keep their eyes open during their adventures, who understood that she couldn't let go, who carried laminated cards with Rebecca's information and the Cessna's tail number in their glove compartments. Rebecca's younger brother, Jack, who'd been 23 when his sister vanished, became a search and rescue volunteer himself 5 years after the disappearance, training in wilderness survival and aircraft accident investigation, driven by the ghost of a sister he couldn't save and a determination that no other family would suffer the same uncertainty if he could prevent it. He spent weekends hiking the Mojave, learning its terrain, understanding how easily it could conceal tragedy, how vast and indifferent nature could be to human suffering. In June 2024, on a scorching afternoon, when the temperature hit 118 degrees near the Nevada border and the desert seemed to shimmer with heat waves that made the horizon dance and blur, a satellite operated by NOAA's Search and Rescue Satellite-Aided Tracking System detected a 416 MHz emergency beacon signal emanating from deep within the Mojave. The transmission lasted exactly 50 seconds, which was standard protocol for an ELT activation, a burst of digital information containing the beacon's unique identifier, GPS coordinates if available, and encoded registration data. The coordinates placed it in a remote section of the Mojave, 38 miles northeast of Barstow, in terrain so rugged that even experienced dirt bike riders rarely ventured there, an area of deep canyons and fractured rock formations that made navigation treacherous. The alert reached the Air Force Rescue Coordination Center at Tyndall Air Force Base in Florida within minutes of detection, routed through automated systems that had been refined over decades of satellite-based search and rescue operations. Cross-referencing the beacon's unique 15-character hexadecimal identifier against registration databases maintained by NOAA and the FAA, technicians found a match that made them pause and double-check their screens, convinced there must be an error in the system. The beacon belonged to N2847Q, a Cessna 182 registered to Rebecca Lang of Lancaster, California. The aircraft had been listed as missing in FAA databases for 21 years, one of dozens of unsolved disappearances that haunted aviation safety officials and family members alike. Patricia received the call at her home in Palmdale, where she'd moved after retiring from her job as a public school teacher. She was 73 now, her hair white, her hands arthritic from years of gripping steering wheels on desert roads, her eyes still sharp despite the decades and the tears. The FAA investigator spoke carefully, his voice professional but not unkind, explaining that a signal had been detected, that it might be nothing more than a false alarm or equipment malfunction, that batteries shouldn't last this long under any normal circumstances, that something highly unusual had occurred and they felt obligated to investigate. Patricia hung up the phone with trembling hands and immediately called Jack, who was at work as a civil engineer but left his office the moment he heard the news. Within hours, a helicopter carrying an FAA accident investigator, an NTSB representative, Jack Lang, and a search and rescue coordinator lifted off from Barstow Daggett Airport, heading northeast into the afternoon heat. They flew over terrain that looked unchanged from 2003, from 1903. From 1,000 years earlier, endless, hostile, beautiful in its severity, keeping its secrets beneath layers of stone and sand. Following GPS coordinates that seemed impossibly precise after so many years of searching in vain, after 8:47 flight hours had found nothing, they approached the area where the signal had originated. Jack pressed his face to the window, his heart hammering so hard he could feel it in his throat, wondering if they were about to find answers or just another cruel disappointment in a long series of false leads and dead ends. The pilot spotted the wreckage first, his trained eyes catching a glint of white metal in a narrow canyon approximately 15 feet below the rim. Invisible from the ground unless you stood directly above it, barely visible from the air unless you knew exactly where to look, and the sun hit at precisely the right angle. The Cessna lay on its left side, partially buried in sand and debris that had accumulated over 2 decades of flash floods and windstorms. The tail section was crushed, folded nearly flat against the fuselage, but much of the main cabin remained surprisingly intact, given the violence of impact and the passage of time. 21 years of desert sun had bleached the paint to a pale ghost of its original color, and flash floods had covered and uncovered the wreck multiple times, leaving layers of sediment like geological strata marking the passage of seasons and years. They couldn't land the helicopter in the canyon, which was too narrow and littered with boulders that made a safe touchdown impossible. Jack and the investigators rappelled down on ropes while the pilots circled above, maintaining radio contact and monitoring the descent. The temperature in the canyon was at least 10 degrees hotter than the surrounding desert, heat radiating from the stone walls in waves that made breathing feel like inhaling from an oven. Up close, the Cessna looked smaller than Jack remembered from photographs his sister had shown him, fragile and broken, a machine that had failed to protect its occupant from the violence of sudden deceleration and the hostility of the environment. The windscreen was shattered into a spider web of cracks, some sections missing entirely. The propeller blades were bent backward nearly 90 degrees, indicating the engine had been running at impact, that Rebecca had been flying, not gliding, when she hit. Jack's hands shook as he approached the pilot's door, forcing himself to breathe slowly, to maintain the professional composure he'd learned during his search and rescue training, even as his entire body trembled with emotion. The cockpit was filled with sand that had blown in through broken windows and the damaged airframe, creating small drifts against the instrument panel. The instruments were corroded beyond recognition, their faces bleached and cracked, needles frozen in positions that no longer meant anything. The seats were bleached and cracked from sun exposure, the fabric deteriorated to the point of disintegration. But Rebecca was there, or what remained after 21 years in the desert heat, a process of mummification and decomposition that the dry air had slowed but not prevented. She was still strapped into the pilot's seat by a 4-point harness, her hands on the yoke in a final grip that death had eventually released, as if she'd held on until the very end, fighting to control the aircraft even as it fell from the sky. Jack turned away, breathing hard through his mouth, fighting the urge to vomit, overwhelmed by the reality of seeing his sister after 21 years, transformed by time and environment into something that barely resembled the person he remembered. The NTSB investigator photographed everything methodically, documenting what 2 decades had left behind with the clinical detachment required of the profession. He took measurements of the impact angles, documented the position of controls, collected samples of fluids and materials that might reveal mechanical failures or other causal factors. The FAA specialist examined the ELT mounted in the tail section behind the rear bulkhead, a position chosen specifically to maximize survival during impact. The unit showed significant impact damage. The G-switch mechanism had clearly activated on the day of the crash, triggered by the sudden deceleration that would have registered well above the activation threshold. But the antenna cable, a thin coaxial line running from the transmitter unit to an external antenna mounted on the upper fuselage, had been completely severed, likely by structural deformation during impact when the tail section compressed and twisted. Without an intact antenna, the beacon's signal couldn't propagate beyond the immediate wreckage, couldn't reach the satellites orbiting overhead, couldn't fulfill its purpose of summoning help. For 21 years, the beacon had sat silent in the wreckage, its battery long dead, its circuits corroded by moisture and time, its purpose unfulfilled in the most tragic way possible. "Then why is it transmitting now?" Jack asked, his voice raw and strained, not really expecting an answer to a question that seemed to defy physics and probability. The investigator turned the ELT over in his gloved hands, studying the corroded casing with the intense focus of someone trying to solve a puzzle that shouldn't have a solution. "It's not," he said quietly, his brow furrowed in confusion. "At least, not this one. This battery died 2 decades ago. Look at the corrosion on the terminals, the way the casing has degraded, what the satellite picked up." He trailed off, frowning, turning to scan the rest of the wreckage with new intensity. They searched more thoroughly, moving methodically through the aircraft's interior despite the heat and the emotional weight of the scene. Behind the pilot's seat, partially buried in sand that had drifted through the cabin over 2 decades, they found Rebecca's flight bag, a worn leather satchel that pilots used to carry charts, navigation tools, flashlights, and other essential equipment. Inside, wrapped in a waterproof pouch that had somehow stayed sealed through 21 years of desert extremes, temperature swings from below freezing to over 150 degrees in direct sunlight and multiple flood events, was a handheld personal locator beacon, a backup device, not standard equipment for the aircraft itself, something Rebecca had purchased separately as an additional safety measure. It was a precaution that marked her as the kind of pilot who took safety seriously, who believed in redundancy and preparation, who'd done everything right and still ended up lost in the desert for 21 years. The PLB's lithium battery, rated for 10 years of shelf life under optimal conditions, should have been completely dead long before 2024, its chemical reactions exhausted, its ability to hold charge depleted by time and extreme temperature cycling. But something, perhaps corrosion creating new electrical pathways, perhaps temperature fluctuations causing brief restoration of chemical activity, perhaps the random physics of electrochemical decay operating in ways that defied normal expectations, had caused a brief electrical discharge sufficient to trigger a single transmission. One final pulse after 21 years of silence, lasting exactly 50 seconds, long enough for a satellite to notice, to record, to relay the information that would finally bring Rebecca home. Jack sat on the canyon rim that night, while recovery teams worked below under portable lights that turned the narrow space into a theater of shadows, carefully extracting Rebecca from the aircraft that had been her tomb for more than 2 decades. The Mojave stretched in every direction around him, cold now that the sun had set, the temperature dropping toward the 20s as it did every desert night. The same dramatic temperature swings that had probably contributed to the impossible resurrection of the beacon. Stars appeared in numbers that city dwellers never see, the Milky Way a river of light overhead, beautiful and indifferent to human tragedy. He called Patricia, his hands numb from cold and emotion, told her they'd found Rebecca, told her it was finally over after 21 years of waiting and wondering. Was she... Patricia's voice broke, unable to complete the question that had haunted her for 2 decades. "It was quick," Jack lied, though he had no way of knowing and the investigators had been careful not to speculate. The impact had been survivable, barely. The cabin structure had remained largely intact, the harness had held, but the canyon was remote beyond measure. The temperatures that August day had been over 110 degrees, and help had never come because the ELT never transmitted its distress call. Whether Rebecca had died on impact from internal injuries, or survived for hours or even days, suffering in the wreckage while search planes passed miles away, was something the investigation might never determine with certainty. The condition of the remains, the lack of soft tissue, the degradation from time and environment all made definitive conclusions about survival time impossible. The NTSB preliminary report, released 6 weeks later after extensive analysis of the wreckage and all available evidence, cited probable engine failure as the cause of the accident. The Cessna's engine, corroded beyond the point where definitive mechanical analysis was possible, showed signs consistent with oil starvation, possibly from a failed seal or deteriorated gasket that would have caused rapid loss of lubrication and subsequent seizure. Rebecca would have had perhaps 5 to 10 minutes from the first indication of trouble to find a landing site, would have seen the canyon too late to avoid it, would have tried to set down in a space too narrow for her wingspan. The right wing had struck the canyon wall first at approximately 85 knots, spinning the aircraft violently into the opposite wall before it dropped to the canyon floor in a descent that lasted less than 3 seconds. Death, the report concluded with the clinical detachment required of official documents, would most likely have been swift, though the evidence did not allow for definitive determination of survival time post-impact. David attended Rebecca's funeral in October 2024, a small service held at a church in Lancaster where they'd been married 13 years earlier. He stood beside his second wife, who understood without him having to explain, trying to reconcile the woman he'd loved with the remains that had finally come home in a sealed casket that would never be opened. The service was small and quiet, attended by people who remembered Rebecca not as a mystery or a cold case, but as a person, a pilot who loved morning flights when the air was still and smooth, a woman who laughed easily and often, who was excited about becoming a mother, who had died alone in the desert while her husband waited for a call that came 21 years too late. Patricia kept the PLB after the investigation concluded and released the evidence, storing it in a wooden box on her mantel alongside photographs of Rebecca at various ages. As a child, as a teenager, on her wedding day, standing beside her Cessna with a smile that radiated pride and confidence. Sometimes she held the corroded device, turning it over in her arthritic hands, marveling at the impossible chain of circumstances that had finally brought her daughter home. A battery that shouldn't have worked, a transmission that shouldn't have been possible, a signal that pierced 21 years of silence at exactly the moment when someone was listening and technology existed to receive it. Jack continued his work with search and rescue, but the unresolved questions haunted him more than the resolution itself. Why had they searched so thoroughly in 2003, logging 847 flight hours, covering hundreds of square miles, and missed the canyon where Rebecca lay? How many passes had aircraft made within miles, within hundreds of feet, while the wreckage sat invisible in its stone crevice, hidden by shadows and angles that made aerial detection nearly impossible? How many other aircraft were out there in the Mojave and other remote regions, lost in canyons and ravines, waiting for an impossible signal that would never come? Families waiting for closure that might take decades or never arrive at all. The Mojave kept its secrets well, as it always had and always would. The landscape that had swallowed Rebecca so completely was vast beyond human comprehension, covering over 48,000 square miles of California, Nevada, Utah, and Arizona, full of places where a small aircraft could disappear and remain hidden, despite the best efforts of searchers using the most advanced technology available. The desert was beautiful and terrible in equal measure, indifferent to human tragedy, capable of preserving bodies for decades in its dry heat, or erasing them completely in a single violent flash flood that could turn a dry wash into a raging torrent in minutes. In February 2025, Jack returned to the canyon alone, hiking in from the nearest access point several miles away, carrying water and GPS coordinates and a need for closure that the funeral hadn't provided. The recovery team had removed the wreckage months earlier, transporting it to an NTSB facility for final analysis. But traces remained. Fragments of aluminum embedded in the rock where wings had struck, a scatter of rivets and glass, weathered smooth by wind and sand, dark stains on stone where fluids had leaked and dried over 21 years. He stood where his sister had died, looking up at the narrow ribbon of sky visible between the canyon walls, imagining those final moments when Rebecca had known there was no way out, when physics and geography had conspired to trap her in a space from which there could be no escape. The investigation raised uncomfortable questions about ELT reliability that echoed through aviation safety discussions and regulatory review boards. How many other beacons had failed to transmit due to antenna damage, leaving aircraft unfound and families waiting indefinitely for news that would never come? The technology had improved significantly since 2003. Modern ELTs included GPS positioning for precise location data, redundant antenna systems designed to survive greater impact damage, and more robust mounting systems that reduced the likelihood of cable severing during crashes. But the Mojave alone held dozens of missing aircraft spanning decades of aviation history, each one a story like Rebecca's, a life that ended in silence, a family left with questions that might never be answered. David moved away from Lancaster in early 2025, selling the house where he and Rebecca had planned their future, where they'd laughed and argued and dreamed about the child they would raise together. Before he left, he drove out to the canyon one last time, navigating rutted dirt roads that barely deserved the name, hiking the final mile in 95-degree heat that reminded him why the desert was so dangerous, why survival in such an environment required preparation and luck in equal measure. Someone, probably Jack, though no one claimed credit, had placed a small metal plaque on the canyon wall above where the Cessna had come to rest for 21 years. It bore Rebecca's name, her dates of birth and death separated by 37 years, and a single line engraved in letters that would outlast memory. She was coming home. Patricia died in her sleep in April 2025, 3 months after finally burying her daughter, her mission complete, her life's purpose fulfilled in the saddest possible way. At her funeral, Jack spoke about the years she'd spent searching, the countless weekends driving desert roads in heat and cold, the refusal to accept that Rebecca was simply gone, even when everyone else had moved on, the network of volunteers she'd organized and maintained for 2 decades. She knew, Jack said, his voice breaking with emotion he couldn't control. Somehow, she always knew Rebecca was out there, waiting, that the desert hadn't erased her completely, that persistence would eventually yield truth. She just had to find her, and in the end, she did. The desert wind blew that day at the cemetery, hot and dry and relentless, carrying the scent of creosote and dust that anyone who'd spent time in the Mojave would recognize instantly. It was the same wind that had blown the day Rebecca disappeared, the same wind that had buried and revealed her wreckage through 21 cycles of seasons, covering it with sand in summer flash floods and exposing it again as water evaporated and sediment shifted. It was the same wind that would eventually erase even the memory of tragedy from the indifferent landscape, scouring away plaques and markers, filling in footprints, reclaiming human intrusions into wilderness. But for now, Rebecca Lang had been found, her remains returned to family, her story told. The mystery that had consumed her mother's final years had been solved, not through human persistence or investigative brilliance or technological advancement, but through the random physics of a dying battery, sending one last, impossible signal across the void after 21 years of silence. In the mathematics of search and rescue operations, in the statistical models that govern probability and resource allocation, it was an anomaly so unlikely that it barely registered on prediction curves, a 1 in a million chance compounded by dozens of other improbable factors. To the family who had waited 21 years for answers, who had driven themselves to exhaustion, searching and hoping and refusing to accept the finality of disappearance, it was either a miracle sent by forces beyond human understanding, or a cruel reminder of how easily tragedy could have been prevented if only a cable hadn't severed, if only the terrain had been different, if only the desert had been less skilled at keeping its secrets. Jack still flies over the Mojave sometimes, part of his ongoing search and rescue duties with San Bernardino County, scanning the landscape for anomalies that might indicate crashed aircraft or missing hikers, for the glint of metal or the geometric shapes that signal human presence in wilderness. He thinks about Rebecca every time the helicopter lifts off, about the fragility of the machines that carry humans across hostile terrain, about the families waiting for news that may never come, about the dozens of other aircraft that remain missing in deserts and mountains across the American West. And sometimes, late at night when he can't sleep, when the memories become too vivid and the questions too persistent, he thinks about that final transmission. 50 seconds of 406 mid-earth signal, impossibly emerging from a battery that had no physical right to function after 2 decades, reaching a satellite that happened to be in exactly the right position to receive it at exactly the right moment. The odds of the battery producing any electrical discharge after 21 years were astronomical, defying manufacturer specifications and electrochemical principles. The odds of that discharge being sufficient to trigger the beacon's transmitter were even lower. The odds of it happening at a moment when the satellite network was operational and positioned to receive the signal, when investigators were still alive and motivated to follow up on a decades-old case, when the family still needed closure desperately enough to drive the investigation forward, were beyond any reasonable calculation. Some called it coincidence, the random intersection of probability and time, a statistical outlier that would be studied in safety journals and academic papers, but ultimately meant nothing beyond chance. Jack, despite his engineering background and his training in evidence-based analysis, preferred to think of it differently. As Rebecca, after 21 years of silence in a canyon tomb, finally finding a way to call out across the void, to send a message that transcended physics and probability, to say goodbye to the people who'd never stopped looking for her. The canyon where she died is unmarked on most maps, just another wrinkle in the Mojave's vast and wrinkled face, one of thousands of similar features that make the desert simultaneously beautiful and deadly. But it has a name now, at least among search and rescue personnel who know the story and understand its significance. They call it Lang Canyon, And when they fly over it during training exercises or actual missions, some of them dip their wings in the traditional aviator's salute to a fellow pilot who vanished into the desert's vastness and lay undiscovered for 2 decades until the impossible happened and the silence was finally miraculously broken. The desert keeps its secrets jealously, holding them close against stone and sand, concealing them from searchers and satellites alike. But sometimes, just sometimes, when conditions align in ways that defy prediction and probability, when the universe arranges itself according to patterns too complex for human understanding, the desert gives those secrets back. Rebecca Lang's story ended in that canyon in August 2003, but it took 21 years, a corroded battery, and an impossible transmission to bring her home. Her legacy lives on in improved beacon technology, in search and rescue protocols refined by the lessons of her disappearance, and in the knowledge that even when hope seems lost, sometimes the desert whispers one final secret to those who never stopped listening.